Hey everybody, welcome back to our study in the book of Revelation, and we are currently in Laodicea, and we're going to be looking at some more aspects of Laodicea now that we're starting to drill down. So this is part 3, and who knows, I might do part 4, part 5. It takes a long time to get through Laodicea because there's a lot of meat there, and so I want to unpack it as best we can because this is the last days church, right? This will be the church during our period of time, right, that we're in. So we're going to continue on, and I'm going to continue where I left off. So if you haven't listened to part 1 and part 2, go ahead and check those out so that way you have the background information before we jump in this part 3, where we just jump right into verses 15 and 16, okay? Okay, so we start in verse 15. Jesus says this, "I know your works." Now, if you were doing good, that would be a positive thing. But if you're doing bad, obviously, as the Laodiceans are, those are pretty scary words. I know your works. And so because they're going to get a pretty hard rebuke, those are not the words you want to hear when you're messing around like Laodicea. Because why? Messiah, being God, obviously, he's the creator, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He knows the condition of the heart of the individual lives that he's talking to. So there's no place to run or hide. We're completely vulnerable in front of God. So a lot of the Laodiceans convince themselves that God doesn't see what they're doing. I know that sounds weird, but the reason they act the way they do is they believe that, you know, that they're okay with God, and that's how they sleep at night, right? And so this is a darkening of their heart, and I'm not even challenging their salvation. I'm challenging where their heart is, and that's where the Lord's going to rebuke them on. Because as you'll see, they can't assess their own spiritual condition of how bad it's become. So anyway, God is saying, "I know your works." Jesus is saying, "I know your works." And he is not pleased, okay? So he tells them, "You are neither cold nor hot." So let's unpack that a little bit. The reference to being hot is and cold is a reference to the 2 rivers that came to Laodicea in the Lycus River Valley. And you had the hot waters of Hierapolis, and it had like mineral springs, like hot mineral springs. And it was for like healing and soothing your muscles. So a lot of people would go to Hierapolis and they would go to these waters and soak in them. And so it was kind of like a hot tub type of place, but it had that mineral water. So if you've ever been into one of these places where you have hot, soothing mineral water, a lot of people go in there and, you know, they're going there for arthritis. They're going there to heal their aches and pains in their joints and muscles. That's what Hierapolis was like. And so that water that came from these hot springs turned into a river and went towards Laodicea. The cold is an allusion to the river that came from Colossae. So the church of Colossae that Colossians, Paul wrote to the Colossians, Colossae is right there by Laodicea. Well, anyway, the cool mountain spring water that came from the snowpack on the hills there would come down and form a river, and it was a cool, refreshing, pure water that you could drink. And so that's the allusion to that river. And that river also went to Laodicea. So as you can see on the map, you had these 2 rivers coming from Colossae, and you had it coming from Hierapolis. And what would happen is these 2 rivers would come together and meet before they hit Laodicea. And what would happen is they would mix. And because they mixed, you had the cool, refreshing water and mixing with the hot spring mineral water. And what would happen is it would create a lukewarm water that was undrinkable. Right? So you had the mineral content, it wasn't hot, it wasn't cold, and if you would drink it, it would make you want to vomit. And hence, Jesus uses their river situation between these 2 rivers coming together and hitting Laodicea to tell them this is the problem with you. So a lot of people that don't know the landscape of the area, and again, this is in modern day Turkey. If you don't know the landscape of the area and don't know how the rivers work, you'll misinterpret when Jesus says cold or hot. Typically, because people don't know the terrain, they'll interpret hot as being on fire for the Lord and cold as being cold to the Lord. And as if Jesus is making a statement of, well, I wish you were either turned against me or for me. But that's not what he's saying at all. That's not the intent, because the Lycus River Valley explains what he means. So what does Christ mean? Well, cold has a benefit, doesn't it? Because it's a cold, refreshing water that you can drink, so it benefits people. The other aspect of the hot is like the mineral springs, soothing your muscles and your aches and pain, so it has a benefit there. So both cold and hot are benefits to people, okay? But the lukewarm water that comes together doesn't benefit anyone. It is what you would call useless. It is useless. It cannot be used for soothing muscles, nor can it be used for drinking water. So what Messiah is trying to tell Laodicea is, you have moved into a position spiritually that's so bad that you are useless to me. I cannot use you anymore. It's like parsley on a platter of fish. No one's going to eat the parsley. They put it on there for decoration, but it's useless, right? And so even Jesus was warning about this in Matthew 5, verse 13 through 14. You probably remember this. He says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing, but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men, right? That's the idea, good for nothing. So when you stop being salty, you're good for nothing. You're useless. He can't use you. So he's not saying you're not saved. He's saying you're a believer that I cannot use anymore. You're not salty. I can't use you in any service whatsoever. And so it might as well just be thrown out on the street and trampled underfoot, because that's where it is. And in verse 14, he says, you are the light of the world. So that brings a responsibility to say, hey, you're supposed to be salty. You're supposed to be light. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. But yet the Laodiceans are hiding their light, okay? And he says, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand. And it gives light to all who are in the house. So he says, let your light so shine before man that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. So that right there is an admonition to all believers that, hey, you're supposed to be shining the light. You're supposed to be salty. Well, Laodicea has stopped it. That's not what's happening. And again, they're useless, especially during the time of the great apostasy. So it makes the problem worse because of the two-pronged issue that's going on, apostasy and uselessness of Christians. And so, I've heard analogies. People are kind of like nails. They lose their usefulness when they lose direction and begin to bend. So when a nail loses its direction by bending, you can't use it again. And that's what's happened to Laodicea. They've lost their direction in life, and so they can't be used. I'll give you another example. There was a great Italian violinist. He was a guitarist, he was a composer. His name was Niccolo Paganini. And he was just tremendous on the violin and all these musical instruments. But anyway, he willed his violin to the city of Genoa on the condition that it must never be played, he said. Well, the wood of that instrument, while it was used and handled, will wear only slightly. But that kind of wood, if you set it aside and don't play it, it begins to decay very fast. And so Paganini's lovely violin has today become worm-eaten, and it is a useless relic. It can't even be played because no one would play it. And so that's the idea of uselessness. That's what's going on here. And he goes, I could wish you were cold or hot. Now, this is interesting. I could wish you were cold or hot. So the way the Greek is saying is that it's a fixed form, which is, I have a wish, but that wish is unattainable. You know, it's like me. I wish I'm a billionaire, okay? So it's that kind of mindset. It never is going to happen, is what I'm trying to say. And in the way the Greek is constructed here, and it's in a fixed form, what Messiah is actually saying, I wish you could change, but you're not. So he already knows the end result, that Laodicea is not going to change. The church is not going to have a revival. The church is not going to do an about face and repent. That Laodicea is the way the church ends. Now, like I've said before, the remnant church will survive all the way through the end. There's no doubt about that. The Philadelphia element, the Smyrna element, all that. But what Christ is saying is there's going to be no change for Laodicea. Now, that comes down to application for individuals. Is he referring to the church in general as being Laodicea? Or can we apply that to believers personally? That's a question that remains. Because we definitely know he's referring to the church in general as Laodicea and with the pockets of the remnant believers. But is he also referring to individual believers that once they enter into a stage personally of Laodicea, is there no way back? I don't know. But the Greek is saying, I wish you could change, but you're not. I know this. Let's not even attempt to be Laodicea, because if that's possible of not coming back from that condition, that's a pretty scary condition to be in. But let's go back to this unattainable wish, okay? So it's a clue prophetically. So again, I want to take it on as a Christendom issue rather than an individual issue, okay? So it assumes that Jesus is wishing this could change, could happen, but it's reached its final state. And because they've reached their final state, this Laodicean church, they have become indifferent and hardened to God. That's what's going on. And the main reason is spelled out later in the text. The main reason is the wealth that they have. That's what sent them in this direction. Like I said before, Laodicea was a very affluent church, very rich church, a banking center, health center. It sold goods and commodities like the black wool and Phrygian eye salve that they made, and they made a ton of money. So that's the indication of how they got off. And so we would call that a worldly believer, right? They're affluent, they love the world, they're part of the world, and that has caused them to move themselves away. And if you use the water aspect that we did about the two rivers coming together from Colossae and then the Hierapolis, and the two rivers mixing together, well, you could also state that the mixing together came from them trying to mix the world with Christianity, and that world being affluence and materialism and whatnot. And so they tried to mix the two, but you can't mix the two. Jesus said you cannot serve two masters. You will love the one and hate the other. And so what Laodicean has done is they tried mixing it, but like Jesus said, you're going to hate one. Well, they have moved into a worldly condition of loving the world. That's what got them into this position of being useless, okay? So that being the case, that explains a lot about what's going on today. It explains a lot of what's going on in Western society. So if you look at America, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, typically Western societies, We are on our heads, spiritually speaking. The church is on its head. The church is thriving in non-Western societies, like in China or Iran or Central and South America. The church is thriving in Africa, right? But it's not thriving in the West, because what is the difference between the West and the rest of the world? I'll tell you, it's affluence. It's the affluence of the West. I mean, I want you to understand this stat. 75% of the world, which is outside of the West, makes about $2 a day. $2, that's it, okay? And it's not to guilt anybody living in the West, because I live in the West, right? I'm not trying to guilt anybody, but we do live in a very affluent society in the West. And what that has caused us is to go blind spiritually. So this is why we're seeing in the West a lack of response to the gospel. We see the churches are in decline. We see more and more young people heading towards pagan spirituality, New Age spirituality, but not coming to Christ because they don't sense any need, right? Because affluence covers up your real need, your spiritual need. Because if all your physical needs are met, you can go blind. That's why Jesus said it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. So anyway, this explains why it's happening. This is what explains why apostasy is happening so much in the West, is because you have this Laodicean concept that they're more interested in their personal lives rather than theology, rather than growing in Christ, rather than maturing. So you have this believer who is tied up in the world. It is as shallow as all get out. And so then you have the pouring out of all kinds of false doctrine and false teachers and false prophets, and they can't defend themselves. And so that's why apostasy is reigning supreme in the West. And that's why these false teachers get away with what they're doing, because they don't have a theologically educated person anymore. The person is more concerned about, where they're going to go on vacation or how they're going to live their lifestyle or what. They're not concerned about growing in Christ and maturing. And therefore, they're fodder for false teachers and false doctrine. So that's what's happening. Interesting enough, and let me make this point, that if you study Sodom and Gomorrah and you look at all the passages that discuss Sodom and Gomorrah outside of Genesis 19, for instance, like Ezekiel 16, God, or through Ezekiel, the prophet, will relate Israel to being like Sodom and Gomorrah, okay? But Ezekiel makes an interesting statement about Sodom and Gomorrah. He gives us a little bit more insight than Genesis 19 gives us. And you know what he said about Sodom? He gave us a clue, and he says, you're like Sodom, Israel, who had abundant food and careless ease. Now that phrase right there adds a little bit more detail of how Sodom and Gomorrah got themselves in the mess that they were in and why homosexuality reigned supreme in these cities. It says they had abundant food and careless ease. You know what that is? Having abundant food means affluence. And a careless ease means that they have leisure time because of the affluence. Now, here's an interesting thing. Historians like Victor Davis Hanson will note that when you see the end of empires, the end of different civilizations, whether it's Greek society, Roman society, or whatever society, what you will notice is that there's two common threads with the destruction of a society from within. And it has to do with affluence and leisure time. And you think, what's the big deal about leisure time? You can understand affluence, what that does, but what does leisure time do? Leisure time means you have too much time on your hands. That 6 days shall you labor. So when someone's not laboring and they're messing around and they have too much time on their hands, well, like, for instance, a good case in point historically is Marx and Engels, who developed Marxism. These guys were supported by Engels' father, Frederick Engels, and they didn't do anything. They didn't work, and they sat around theorizing about what would be a better world, and they came up with what we call Marxism, communism, whatever you want to call it. And this came at the leisure time of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They had too much time on their hands, so they got these whacked out ideas, and now we have them all through our society. But you even look at people who don't work, who have too much leisure time, they're on welfare or whatever they're doing, working the system, and they don't work. You know what happens many times? Their sin nature starts running amok. Because God gave us work. God gave us work, and work actually is the deterrent towards sin because you're worried about providing for your family, making a living, paying your bills, and you don't have time to sit around and theorize if Marxism or communism works or what you're going to do today and get yourself into trouble. And you know the old saying, an idle mind is the devil's playground. And you've heard that saying. Well, there's truth to it. So what ends up happening in Sodom and Gomorrah and in the West today is we have an abundance of food, which is affluence, and a careless ease. We have too much leisure time. And that is the problem with Laodicea. They had that same problem. And so here we are today. So what does it do? It creates indifference towards spiritual things. It creates an apathetic attitude towards spiritual things, right? As the person goes into worldliness and again, theologically shallow. This is a very spiritually dangerous position for the person to be in. Do you know why? It's not just simply because they can be deceived from false teachers and false doctrine. It's that they are self-deceived. That the problem that they get into is they're out of reality. They cannot discern what has actually happened to them. They don't see their own spiritual condition as being dangerous. And so that's why Jesus comes to them and rebukes them. And he gives them a true evaluation of what they are spiritually. And that's the last thing they thought he would say. They thought they were blessed of God because of their affluence and their leisure time. That God was actually blessing them. And again, that's a total misinterpretation of how God works. Let's unpack that, because that's part of the word of faith movement today, that you're supposed to be healthy and wealthy and that kind of nonsense. And by the way, that's nothing new under the sun. That kind of mentality goes all the way back to the Pharisees in rabbinic Judaism during Jesus' time, that thought that rich people were blessed of God and went to heaven, and poor people were cursed of God. And so Jesus turned that right on its head and said, that's not how things work. And he pointed that out in the story about the rich man and Lazarus in Luke chapter 16, because the rich man goes into hell. Remember that? So that turned everything on its head. So that was incorrect. But yet, that's how a lot of people see their lives, that, well, if I'm materially wealthy, then I must be blessed of God. If my life is leisurely and I don't have really a lot of problems, then I must be blessed of God. That is actually the opposite. Because if you're getting no opposition from Satan, if you're getting no pushback from this world should hate you because it hated the Messiah. But if you're not and you're loved by everyone, that's a problem. That's a huge problem. And so people misinterpret that, and then they misinterpret the new covenant. The new covenant says that we've been engrafted in, okay? And what does that mean? Well, Paul will lay it out in Ephesians, that we are blessed with every spiritual blessing in the heavenlies. Notice what he said, spiritual blessing, not material blessing, not physical blessing. Can God bless you materially if he wants to? Yes. But the new covenant does not provide for it. It only says that we partake in the spiritual blessings. The physical blessings that will come in the new covenant are for Israel when they get saved. And the kingdom will be established and they'll be on their land. Okay, so it is a huge mistake to expect that once we're a believer, that God should just shower us with material blessings and make our lives easy and make us healthy. That is a lie from the pit of hell. It has no basis whatsoever. So anyway, this is what Laodicea has deceived themselves with. On an individual level, they think that. They think living as a millionaire or whatever must be blessed. Well, okay, how do you translate that to a Christian in Africa under a mud hut? How do you translate that mentality to Christians in China who are in cellars? How do you translate that to Christians who are undercover in Iran and worried about the Ayatollahs killing them and they're in poverty, or in Central America or South America, wherever? That kind of mentality, the Laodicean mentality, doesn't translate to the rest of Christendom. Let me put this out there. For the last 2,000 years, Christians have been poor. That's the hallmark of real Christians. They're typically poor. They don't make it in high society, okay, for obvious reasons. And so we have gotten to the stage in Laodicea where in the West, the income of Christians has drastically increased beyond all comprehension to the rest of biblical history as far as believers are concerned, okay? So this is a real problem. Christians for the last 2,000 years have been typically poor, okay? That's been the trait. So now we live in a different time, affluence, right? And look what it's done. It has totally deceived many, many believers, right? And so they can't evaluate themselves. And look, if you can't evaluate yourself spiritually, and knowing that whether you're in fellowship with the Lord or not in fellowship, and whether you're doing the right things or you're misinterpreting, that's pretty scary. That means the further that you go out of that reality and into an unreality, the worse you become. You don't think straight, right? And you end up altering reality for yourself, right? That's pretty scary. You become checked out. I call them Christian zombies. That's what they've turned into. They're nothing but Christian zombies. They go to church and they do their thing, but they check the box off, and they don't think about anything they heard. They don't think about how they live, and they check the box and they think they're good, and they go on with their affluent lifestyle. And they're asleep and blind, and Christ can't even use them. They're unusable. Christ will not use that type of person. So anyway, if you think about this, and I'm going to end on here, what you'll see is he'll tell them, behold, I stand at the door and knock. Well, he's telling that to believers that they're so out of fellowship, they don't even know they're out of fellowship with him. So he's standing at the door and knocking, and that's not a salvation passage. It is a direct insult to them for the condition that they are, that in their church, Christ is not even in there. He's not even welcomed. And so he's knocking at the door saying, let me in, to the believer of Laodicea. And he says, I will come in and dine with him and he with me. And that's a sign of fellowship, right? That's a sign of I want to be back in fellowship with you. So it's not Christ, the one that pulled away. It is the Laodicean that pulled themselves away. So anyway, that's how to understand hot and cold and lukewarm and being useless, okay? So we'll continue this discussion as he then starts unpacking the judgment of this. He says, I will vomit you out of my mouth, which is a sign of judgment. We'll go into that. Then we'll go into their real spiritual condition as he outlines it to them of saying, this is what you're lacking. And he starts enumerating many, many things that we're going to talk about in the future. So anyway, that will be for next lesson, part 4. So continue to study your Bible and drill down as hard as you can, because it's important that you know the scriptures, okay? All right, we'll see you next time. God bless you.